glad that the curfew had been imposed following the verdict and the report from the Van der Vaart Commission, and he had noticed that the measure was working well for the age group under 16. The number of cases of unruly youth, mostly of foreign parents or origin, of that age, who had caused quite a bit of trouble, had decreased, and criminal violence had reached a new low thanks to the many police patrols. However, questions began to arise about people who had disappeared and were suspected to have been arrested. There were even stories about an American prison in Bosnia where some well-known Dutch people were said to be detained. Policymakers were all trying to bask in the glory of the new plans and were being celebrated by the masses for their success. Balkenende, the puppet of this queen, was the loudest, and many began to believe he was indeed a true leader instead of a soft-boiled egg, Harry Potter. It seemed that the cabinet had made the right decisions regarding restoring peace. The population was made to believe that the measures were taken for their safety. The same population that hardly realized that a web was being woven in which they would soon be devoured. Tom had also delved into matters that drew attention on the internet, and he had noticed that here in our country and in other parts of the world, things were increasingly resembling a fascist police state. The program Pauw en Witteman, a worthy successor to Barend and Van Dorp, was becoming increasingly critical with questions to the government, reaching its peak with a broadcast in which Willem Middelkoop, the stock market specialist of the RTLZ program, gave his view on the now sharply falling stock markets and the real threat this posed to the economy. He was harsh in his comments, blaming the American Federal Reserve Bank as the main culprit in what he called a pyramid scheme. By printing banknotes not backed by a product like gold and without any added value beyond the paper they were printed on, they were causing a devaluation of their own currency. The debt and interest, which ultimately have to be paid by the American taxpayer over this and the previously borrowed money from this federal bank by the government, are currently so high that it cannot possibly be repaid. Not now, but also not in the future. Due to the high national debt, inflation arises, meaning that the prices of products increase. This, combined with a lower currency value, the dollar currently has a real value of 6 cents, and you have a problem. Bankers have been placed under guardianship by governments, but are not punished for their mismanagement, and the deadly threat of a depression currently hangs over the entire world like the sword of Damocles. Willem Middelkoop warned about this in the same broadcast. He cited the free market as an example, seeing it as a total failure and one of the causes of this crisis. The increasingly larger companies, profits, and the associated bonuses and salaries lead to greed and a grab culture within these large companies. Without oversight and regulations, fishing is done with a net with very large meshes. This looting continued even after the so-called bailout, a plan where the government invested an amount of $800 billion and kept various banks afloat. Banks in America, the Netherlands, and Belgium, such as Fortis, suddenly appeared to be led by unscrupulous people. This manifested in an expensive nightclub in Monaco, where a multi-million-dollar party was exuberantly celebrated by Fortis Belgium just after they narrowly escaped bankruptcy. Willem also mentioned that these and other leading companies meet annually under the name of the Bilderberg Group and conduct business in a manner that can be seen as dubious. This fact is denied by the big companies, saying that the attendees have their annual golf and relaxation party there, because they then find themselves among equals, a like-minded situation. The press does not publicize this because they are forbidden to report on these meetings, which have been held for more than 60 years, annually in a different country. All world leaders and captains of industry are present, and Balkenende was a guest in Geneva last year. Willem was called to account behind the scenes after this broadcast, and it was then announced to viewers that Willem was on vacation for an indefinite period. Everyone thought it was stress due to his high-pressure work during the recent crisis weeks. The truth, however, was that he had been called to account for his remarks concerning the American Fed, a fate that politician Marianissen had already encountered earlier after he made some comments about the so-called globalization on the same program. Nissen rightly got very angry about the prevailing criminal and money-hungry grab culture, which according to him was now also influencing politics. The salaries of politicians had to go up while the common man had already been tightening his belt for years, and whose wages had been halved by the introduction of the euro. He accused some members of parliament of being too influenced by companies that invited them on trips and outings to use a meeting of their company for a lecture. These well-sponsored trips were eagerly accepted and booked as study trips with travel expenses during the summer months during a very long recess. They flew with private jets, so there were no evidence of plane tickets. The villas, built by friendly real estate dealers, had already been the subject of fierce debates a month earlier, where the PVV had already warned the public about these practices that turned out to be common. 3 members of parliament admitted that a friend, often a schoolmate, had lent them money at a friendly rate, allowing them to build that basement or attic. Tom found a lot of information on sites that were no longer accessible via regular servers and were now provided by the truly free press from various islands. These sites, under the name Call for the Truth, usually appeared irregularly and were visible for as long as they were, before disappearing just as suddenly. Similarly, the site of the Next Genesis Foundation and their videos appeared in this way. Rumors were that the matter would soon be presented to the United Nations, and that the man behind this organization, Farmidow, would give a speech in this, according to him, stronghold filled with Pharisees. He intended, according to his statements, to enter the lion's den to silence the beast forever. Farmiedow's organization had already been noticed in several countries for their prominent social work, resulting in increasing name recognition. The name was now Googled more than 3 billion times daily, and various people within the United Nations were becoming curious, especially after the newspaper article featuring Farmidow that appeared in the Washington Post following the gruesome videos on the internet and his organization's plans behind them. He had made the remark about the temple in this article, alongside his statement that he preferred to stay in the background but was determined to improve the world and warn of the almost inevitable downfall within 5 years. He mentioned the story of the Mayan calendar and its prediction of the end of times. Farmidow stated that he accepted this as truth, given the great knowledge and wisdom the Mayans possessed in their time. He did not agree with the notion that the end of times immediately meant the end of humanity. He was convinced that solar storms causing solar winds would affect the electricity on Earth, or that the approach of a large planet which crossed our solar system once every 26,000 years would bring about a gigantic change on Earth. A shift of the poles and a different rotation direction were, according to him, a more logical explanation for a disaster of global proportions. This change could be managed by everyone if governments were willing to help with an evacuation to another planet, or to enormous underground shelters with a capacity of 150,000 people, of which, according to confidential sources, several had already been built and were now being prepared for this natural disaster. According to Farmidow, governments know very well what is going to happen. The problem lies in the lack of shelters and deciding who can be saved and who cannot. They also know the consequences of a warning, such as, "Dear world inhabitants, we regret to inform you that 2/3 of the population will die due to terrible natural disasters occurring from now until 2012. We, as governments and the very rich, have already taken our measures and do not care about all the people who will die." Such a message would lead to anarchy, violence, and chaos, and it was probably better for the lucky ones that no one knew about it and it would be seen as a twist of fate. This played perfectly into the hands of the global elite, the Bilderberg attendees, and the figures at the top of the pyramid. Their plan was to involve no more than 1.5 billion people in their new world order. They themselves would be the natural leaders, living in excessive luxury and prosperity, with a controlled mass of slave laborers beneath them, willing to die for their master. The rest of the world population could not be saved, and according to them, that meant cleared is clean. He found it very strange that a country like America did so little for its own infrastructure, with bridges on the verge of collapse and entire cities turning into ghost towns. The countryside was turning into a vast, manipulated soy field. Grain, i.e., food, was being replaced by this plant to supply the bio-industry, a new invention of the oil barons with the necessary clean fuel. The article had caused quite a stir. The funny thing was that after the interview, it turned out that the interviewee was not Pharma but an employee of the Dutch branch. Moreover, Frank knew the young man as Marcel van Nimwegen, the RDM employee. Tom didn't know him, but had heard of him from Frank. Marcel said that Farmiedo wanted to stay in the background, but had given permission to present himself as Farmiedo's deputy because the message was too important. The world needed to be awakened. And now, with a new American president on the horizon, it was indeed time for change. He hoped that Barack Obama was the man he pretended to be, and hoped to fight with him against the money-hungry corporate business, starting with the fair distribution of money flows and the transition to clean, sustainable energy. However, he still doubted the politician. Was he the new JFK, or was he a wolf in sheep's clothing? Money and power do strange things to people. But who was this Farmiedo really?
Tom decided to go out for a night on the town, craving some old-fashioned fun, and chose to head to the Pantoffel. He arrived at the cafe at 9:30 p.m. and joined the regular group of patrons at the bar, including Willem Pleur, a former German student who now worked as a financial manager at the staffing agency Workforce and was always good for a laugh. Also present was the son of old Herber, Sean, who sat in his usual spot, observing everyone and everything in a relaxed manner, occasionally smiling when a woman glanced his way. Weeb, an old army buddy of Tom, was there too, a true motorbike enthusiast. Tom took a seat on a bar stool and ordered a round for the whole group, while Cold as Ice by Foreigner played from the speakers. By 11 p.m., Roland and Wendy had joined the group, and the atmosphere was great. Work was temporarily forgotten as the whole crew loudly sang along to Hayes's song Bloed, Zweet and Trainen, which had become the anthem for FC Den Bosch supporters. Tom and Roland, both slightly tipsy, stood together by the restroom. "Have you ever experienced anything strange?" Roland asked Tom. "A couple of weeks ago, I experienced something really bizarre at the paranormal fair." "Oh, that's a fun fair. Did you see a ghost or a spirit?" Roland replied, the smell of alcohol wafting from his breath. "Yeah, make jokes about it," Roland answered, clearly quite drunk. "No, seriously." He leaned towards Tom, slightly swaying, and told him the story of his encounter with a fortune teller, ending with the phrase she had given him, which he still couldn't make sense of. Tom felt his stomach churn when he heard Roland say, "Simplicity is beauty." What was happening now? He had almost forgotten about it. He invited Roland and Wendy to come over to his place for a nightcap later. That would be more comfortable and refreshing. Roland agreed, and they both returned to the bar, where Roland told Wendy that they would be going to Tom's place later. Wendy, also quite tipsy, belted out "I Will Survive" by Gloria Gaynor into the microphone, which was now connected, to enthusiastic applause and occasional yee-haw shouts from the other patrons. It was an old-fashioned good time. After the lively evening, Tom poured 3 cups of steaming coffee while standing at the bar in his apartment. The walk to Barrowoutstraat had sobered them up partially and made them hungry, so they had grabbed a shawarma sandwich on Hinthamerstraat. Wendy found Tom's house tastefully decorated and chose to sit at the large oak table, preferring it over lounging in an armchair. Once they were all seated, Tom recounted his story about the climb and his vision, the visit to St. John, and the phrase, "Simplicity is beauty." Roland sobered up instantly and looked at Tom in astonishment. Wendy, a bit lost in the conversation, was glad when the chubby Persian cat, Blooper, jumped into her lap and started purring happily. Tom talked about the Next Genesis Foundation and their projects. Roland was familiar with the foundation, having attended a meeting after the market tragedy. He was very impressed with their way of working, which was gaining traction among entrepreneurs. The so-called social tax implemented by RDMM was set aside for public benefit, providing free internet in several neighborhoods. Solar panels were installed on rooftops wherever possible, supplying the entire neighborhood with free energy. Roland also knew about their support fund for the Wind Island project along the coast and their socially involved TV programs, often featuring positive news. They decided to let the matter rest for now, as they had no idea what it could mean. However, they planned to use their network and the internet to learn more about the Next Genesis Foundation and the man behind the scenes. It was already late, and Tom offered them to stay the night in the guest room.
The meeting. Frank thought it would be a good idea to talk to the third suspect, David Jaruba. After a phone call with his contact person and a call with Tom, an appointment was made at the coffee shop next to the St. Jacob's Church on Tom knew the security guard there, Robert Deneboom, a Moluccan man who had won several kickboxing matches in his spare time and was on the verge of breaking into the K1 professional class. He knew exactly who frequented the establishment and would handle any unfamiliar customers, ensuring privacy. Lawyer Willink was now also involved because Frank found it handy to have a law book on hand to avoid overstepping the bounds with the plans he had devised in recent days. No one objected to smoking a joint because it might help with the conversation that Frank was recording for later evidence. Frank began the conversation. "You all know why we're here tonight and the danger we're in. What we have in our possession can put an end to democracy as we know it. The photos, the witnesses, the evidence are piling up. But I first wanted to start with David to hear his side of the story, particularly what exactly happened on the market." David began to speak. "I had been trying to calm myself all day. I knew what was going to happen. I had already visited the mosque and was therefore wearing my traditional attire. In the mosque, I had a conversation with my imam and laid out the problem for him. He told me that I must do everything to prevent the attack, especially because it would put the Islamic community in a better light, rather than if the attack succeeded. That afternoon, I got a call from an acquaintance asking if I could come to Tilburg. I knew nothing about the suicide note and their plans, but I knew then that the attack would go ahead and that they would be blamed for it. And yes, I saw how one security guard shot the other security guard after he got out and first put 2 bullets in Wilder's head. He saw me and started shooting in my direction. The first bullet whizzed past me, and he was already aiming for a second shot. I shed my robe and went straight to my cousin here in the city." Frank passed around the photo of the agent shooting in David's direction, and everyone began nodding. Frank wanted to know more. Who were the people who had recruited them, and how well did he know them? Frank asked, "Who is Imam Grossfeld, and what is his role?" David replied, "He was the one who was inciting us in that so-called training camp." "No, we didn't have to go to an Al-Qaeda camp in Damascus. This could just as well be done in the forests here in the Netherlands. It was a former monastery and was now being used by companies as a team-building center. You could do all sorts of things there. Canoeing, riding quads. We received shooting training under the guise of paintballing, but with sedatives in the tips of the arrows. We were given medications like Ritalin, and sniffing was allowed. We played along with their game, looked for a way out, pretended, smoked weed but didn't sniff, and kept our wits about us but couldn't do anything, as has been shown." That Grossfeld preached from early morning until late at night. He seemed to be very good friends with that fat guy from the AIVD, a certain Peter Schultz, an elitist man with a rather dark past. The infamous Joseph Mengele, der Teufelsdoktor, was an older half-brother of his father. I heard him bragging about it one evening when we were all drugged, and he, drinking whiskey, was listening to yet another sermon from Grossfeld. As he got drunker and started to clearly get annoyed with, he began telling the story of his famous relative. He said that he knew what to do about the integration problem. No mercy, but a loving euthanasia for all of Africa and the entire Middle East. No one dared, but someone had to do it. Too few resources and food in the future would cause problems if the population remained so large. You distract them with sex and gambling. You fill them with drugs and give them hope for a better future. How do you get a population to go along with it? Easy, if you want them to believe in something, create an imaginary enemy and occasionally make it a real enemy. and you have the confusion, fear, and panic needed to move to the end. The extermination can begin. The rest will be kept alive, and these are only the strongest who survive the natural selection through the submission of all kinds of chemical means and impulses by the government in the service of business. Those who are healthy will survive. Look around you and you can see the selection already happening. Advertisements aimed at the new modern, non-smoking, talking, thinking, healthy slave. When you want to follow people with a chip, it's easy to know where people are and live, so you are relatively safer in Europe at the moment than somewhere in a backwater in the countryside of Tijdsgeest to avoid being the first to be sacrificed. In the end, it doesn't matter. If Mengele had his way and time, it would have just happened earlier. With current technology, the former fascists and current fascists are finally where they want to be, total world domination. Frank and the rest looked at David and didn't know what to make of it. Frank asked, "That Peter Schultz? Is it this man?" He handed David the photos taken by Suzanne. David immediately recognized Peter as Peter Schultz. He also named Grossfeld upon seeing the second photo and pulled a face that suggested nothing good. Roland handed him the photos with Stephen and asked if he knew this man. David replied, "That is Omar Abdul bin Laden. He works for the Saudi Arabian intelligence service, and their secret police, is also on the payroll of the CIA and was here with a dual purpose. Besides this attack, another attack is planned."